Welcome to today's video. In today's video I want to talk to you about this little camera, the Fuji X100 6 again, because over the past few weeks and months this camera has gotten quite a lot of attention, as most of you will know, both good and bad. Now, I see a lot of comments about this camera on some of my videos which say that this camera is basically just fashion accessories for hipsters, that it is completely overpriced, that anyone with a sound mind would probably go for another type of camera instead, and that all of the people that are buying this camera are idiots. Now, I can absolutely see where the people that leave this type of comment are coming from, and I actually do think that they are probably right to a degree, but at the same time I think that this camera currently does get a bit of a bad rap for being sort of an influencer, fashion accessory, whatever type of camera, and that is also sort of undeserved, because I still think that it is an absolutely great camera. And so I wanted to make the video, I wanted to just strong arm both sides of the argument and give you sort of a nuanced perspective by someone who actually owns the Fuji X100 6, and I've also owned the Fuji X100V and the Fuji X100F before that, and I also do own something like the Leica Q2 and other cameras like the Sony a7 IV that I'm filming on right now, which is probably more of a workhorse camera. Both of these I'd categorize more of like everyday cameras or fun cameras, quote unquote, even though they are certainly still capable of putting out very professional results. But anyway, let's get into it and let's start out with the negative arguments that you can make about this camera. Now, one thing that you will hear or read quite often is that this camera is just sort of a fashion accessory. And you can clearly see where that is coming from, because you will see a lot of photos of the Fuji X100 Mark VI or other Fuji X100 cameras online, and you can sometimes get the impression that this camera is used as a prop for photos more often than it is for actually taking photos. I certainly think that that is not true, but this camera has a tendency to be very present on camera and not, as the camera taking the photo, at least on Instagram. And I mean, to be fair, this camera is just really good looking. I think there is barely anyone who would disagree with that statement. If you ask me, the Fuji X100 line of cameras are some of the greatest looking cameras that you can buy right now. And this camera, in my opinion, is probably the best looking digital camera that is available on the market right now, maybe with the exception of the Leica M11P. But I would say, even though only by a small fraction, but I would say that it is actually better looking than the Leica Q2 and certainly better looking than the Leica Q3. But that's just my opinion. You might wildly disagree with that statement, but I think most people would still agree that it is a good looking camera. And as that, obviously, being photographers or photography enthusiasts, we are sort of drawn to aesthetically pleasing things and views and people and whatnot, aren't we? And so I think it's only natural that a lot of us are also drawn to cameras that are very aesthetically pleasing. And therefore I think it makes quite a lot of sense to have a camera that is nice looking. Now, I'll also tell you that with this camera being my EDC camera, it is kind of just nice to have it out and about and it just doesn't look out of place. For example, if you put this camera next to your wallet or whatever on the table in a restaurant, it just will not look out of place and it will not distract people in a negative way. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but back in the day when I was still a Canon DSLR shooter, when I would whip out my gigantic Canon DSLR and put that on a table in a restaurant, everyone around me would just immediately get sort of nervous, as if I was a paparazzi and trying to take photos of them in their most intimate moments, which obviously wasn't the case. I was still just trying to document my day-to-day life, and I always just wanted to have a camera with me and at the ready. But that is certainly a reaction that I've never gotten with any of my Fuji X100 cameras, or in fact my Leica Q2. But yeah, I'd still say that the argument is fair to a point. I think that most people would agree, even the ones that hate on the Fuji X100 6, that having a good looking camera in and of itself certainly isn't a bad thing, unless you have to pay just vastly more for it than it is worth in terms of its functionality, or if the camera had a reputation for not actually being used as a photography camera, but just as an accessory or as a prop for photos. Again, I think the latter has some truth to it, but I still think most people who own this camera, who spend the money on this camera, will use this for photography. And with that, let's talk about whether or not this camera is capable as a camera and whether or not it's overpriced. So with that, first of all, some people say that this camera is a bad camera for the same reason that something like the Leica Q2 or maybe a Ricoh GR, whatever, might be a bad camera, and that is because they do come with a fixed lens, and the only cameras that people should buy are interchangeable lens cameras. And obviously, interchangeable lens cameras do have a big advantage. You can change your lenses, and that is an advantage. And the arguments for a fixed lens camera are usually that, well, first of all, it forces you to be more creative and get more familiar with one certain type of lens and field of view. And I do think there is a lot of truth to it, but the counter argument that you get to that statement a lot of the time is that even if you have an interchangeable lens camera, you can simply just go out with it with just one single lens, or even if you have something like a zoom lens, just leave it at 35 millimeters, for example, and you're good to go. And I mean, obviously that is true, but it's not that easy in real life. So I think that argument sort of falls flat, because speaking for me personally, if I have a camera backpack full of all of my gear, let's say I have my Sony a7 IV with me with all of my lenses, I will constantly just think about the lenses and the selections that I have available. And even if I'm just leaving the house and thinking about leaving with only one lens attached to my Sony a7 IV, you know, I really sort of struggle with that, and it makes the decision of bringing just the right lens a bit harder in my opinion. And that is obviously not a really negative stress, that is very much self-induced, but it is kind of a stress. And something like this, something like the Leica Q2 certainly alleviates that stress, because it makes that decision for you. You know, different things work for different people, so I think there's no right or wrong. I certainly like having a fixed lens camera, others might disagree though. But with that aside, is the Fujifilm X100 actually a good camera? Is it capable of putting out great results? And I'm just going to say that yes, it absolutely is, and I don't think that any sane human being would disagree. The main argument of people who say that it isn't is not that the X100 isn't a good camera in and of itself. It's more along the lines of it might be good, but it's not good for the price that you have to pay for it. And well, that might be a fair argument, but I don't think it is necessarily true. I mean, obviously it is an APS-C camera, it is not a full frame camera, but considering that you do get a high quality lens with this camera, paying $1,800 for it, especially in a package like this, really isn't that outlandish. Because obviously you do also have to factor in all of the other aspects that you do get with this camera. So let's talk about that, because the X100, in my opinion, is sort of a Swiss Army knife of the camera world. Now let me explain. Now this is the Victorinox Cybertool Large. This is probably one of the most functional Swiss Army knives that you can buy. It has all of the tools, it has all of the functionality, and it is essentially sort of a tool chest that fits into the palm of your hand. And it is very nice to have it on you all of the time, because that means that you are able to fix a lot of things without having to go to your actual tool chest and grabbing the right tool for the job. Now, with that being said, a lot of the things that you have on the Victorinox Cybertool Large will work in a pinch and will make you very grateful for having them on there, but at the same time they are obviously not as good as their full-size counterparts that you have in your actual tool chest. And the same is sort of true with the Fuji X100. So for example, the X100 is certainly capable of filming great videos, but it doesn't have the greatest autofocus, it doesn't have a flip screen, and it isn't that great in low light situations. So if what you really want is a video-centric camera, the Fuji X100 is not the right camera to go with. The Fuji X100 also, for example, has an integrated ND filter, which is absolutely fantastic. Most cameras don't, but obviously that integrated ND filter doesn't give you nearly as much range or the right amount of stops all of the time. So you have more flexibility if you were to go with an external ND filter, which you can also mount to the X100V, but that would also require you to screw on an adapter to the front element of the lens so that it actually does have a filter mount. And while we're talking about the front element of the lens, you can also screw other accessories like a teleconversion lens or a wide angle conversion lens to the front element of your fixed lens, and thereby converting that lens to either a 28mm or a 50mm full frame equivalent field of view. And while I think that it is absolutely fantastic that you can do that, and you can buy both of the conversion lenses for around $500 or so, and therefore you have like the 3 standard focal length plus the camera for around $2,300, which is a bargain, but it's probably not as good as having 3 dedicated primes with the respective focal length. The same, for example, is also true in regards to the hybrid viewfinder. You do get a hybrid viewfinder, so this is not only an electronic viewfinder with a display, but you can also use it by just looking through the actual viewfinder and using that to frame your shots. But it isn't quite the same experience that you would get with something like a Leica M, so a true quote-unquote rangefinder camera. But the flip side is obviously that with something like the Leica M11, you do not get the additional electronic viewfinder, which is also integrated into the hybrid viewfinder of the Fuji X100 VI. The Fuji X100 VI also comes with a flash, albeit not the greatest flash the world has ever seen. The camera also comes with IBIS. It is fairly weather resistant, at least if you also screw on an extra filter to the front element of your lens. And it also shoots 6K video in 10-bit in f-log. So this camera just comes absolutely jam-packed with all of the features in a still fairly compact body, and for what I would consider, especially if you look at all of the features that it has, and the fact that it comes with a lens, quite a fair price. So yeah, in conclusion, I certainly think that this camera is absolutely worth the money. I think that it is worth the hype. It is a very good looking camera. It is nice to look at, but it is also just a very nice tool to work with. Now, with that being said, it is not the right tool for every job, and it doesn't want to be. There are cameras that are more flexible, that are more robust, that offer higher quality and easier video shooting abilities, or that are better for photography in so many ways, but most of them are sort of either very, very specialized, or they do cost a lot more. And I think this X100 VI is sort of a package that isn't really offered anywhere else. And therefore, I think it is quite unique and quite deserving of its good reputation. Now let me know what you think about the Fuji X100 VI. Is it deserving of its overall probably good reputation, or do you also think that it is overpriced and more of a fashion accessory? Again, me personally, I think that certainly both can be true at once, but overall I would say that it is worth the price, and it is worth the hype, and it also is worth waiting for if you've got one on pre-order. Anyway, that's all I got for you today. I hope this was somewhat interesting to you. I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care. Bye.